Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome back for another card video. Today's card, I took one die and made two cards out of it, one with the positive and one with the negative. The die I'm using is the Stampin' Up! Rose Garden Thinlits dies, and I'm using the large one. I'm also using my Gonzai Tambi watercolors. I'm going to be using these two oranges and these two greens. So I'm going to go ahead and pull those out and get them ready. I'm going to take a piece of Strathmore watercolor paper, I'm going to put my die directly on it, and then I'm going to mark where my rose meets my leaves, and that's where my orange is going to meet my green. And I'm also marking how far out I need to color. Now I have a big fat brush and a tissue, so I'm going to be really careful not to get my cardstock too wet, and I'll show you when I'm done here what happens when you get your cardstock too wet. So I'm going to just wet it up just a little bit where my green is going to be, and notice that I stopped where the green is going to end so I don't move into the orange too quickly. And I'm going to start with the lighter one, and I'm just going to drop some color in, leaving some space for the dark. And then I'll take my dark and put it in there. And the Gonzai Tambi watercolors don't blend. They require a little bit more forceful blending, so they don't blend as much on their own as some of the other watercolors do, which is good in this case because I don't want them to blend too much. And now I'll work on the other side here, dropping in some water first and then putting some color. And notice that I put a little bit too much water on this side. You could see it start to pool up, which I wasn't happy about, so I grabbed my tissue and I pulled some of that water up. And then I took my brush and sort of moved it around a little bit. And notice I'm also wiping my brush when it doesn't have any color on it, just to get some of that excess water off, because this is a fat brush and so it'll retain quite a bit of water. Now it's time for the orange. I'm going to prep my watercolor paper with a little bit of water, and you can see that green is already starting to move into the water. And I'm going to drop my orange in, and you'll notice that I'm just going to barely touch the green because I really don't want them to mix too much right now. If I overlap them, it'll become a little muddy, and I really don't want that, obviously. So now I'm dropping in some of the orange. So I'm going to let them touch, but I'm not going to let them blend too much. And notice I have a little bit too much water, so I'm kind of moving it off to the side and soaking it up with my tissue. And this will make sure that I get a nice, pretty smooth watercolor. I decided to add a little bit more of these darker spots because I want it to be really vibrant and colorful, which these watercolors really can be if you apply them correctly. So you can see I'm kind of going up to the green but not touching it. And they're already starting to come together a little bit. I do want them to blend just a tad, but not too much. So on their own, they're going to do plenty enough blending. And now what I like to do is where it starts to pool on the edge, I just touch a tissue to the very, very edge of my cardstock, like barely touching the cardstock. And the tissue will soak in a bunch of the excess water. And that way, if you leave the color as it is, it'll start to creep back into your cardstock and it won't be a very pretty look. So you can see where I added that extra water on the green, and I'm just going to put my tissue next to it. It'll suck it up without pulling any of the color off the edge. And once I clean up that edge, I'm going to leave it to dry, just like that. So I talked a little bit about using too much water. So here's the dried panel. You can see how nice, smooth, and even it is. Now this is the one I created first, which had too much water. You can see it has all these white spots where it's creeping in, and then the pools of the green that just had too much water, and I let it dry like that, and where the cardstock warped, where it was bending upward, it was white. So just not a pretty look. So you want to just be careful about how much water you have. Now I'm going to put my die right there, make sure that my leaves are in the green, my flowers in the orange, and I'm going to die cut it out. I'm going to use both pieces, so I'm going to put that off to the side. And the first thing I'm going to do is poke out all these pieces with a paper piercer. And I'm going to be careful because I'm going to put all these back, so I want to make sure they have a pile of them and I don't lose any of the little ones. So I'm going to gather them up and push them off to the side, make sure I don't lose anything. And then I'll work on getting the outline out. And it really doesn't take too much effort. You just pop in a couple of holes and it'll pop out. I did use a Mylar shim when I ran it through my Big Shot to make sure that I got a nice clean cut. And that came out really pretty. I was really happy with that. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is cut another one out of just some Neenah Solar white cardstock. So I'll take that one I just cut out of the white, I'll put it inside my negative, and I'm going to flip it over. And I've done this technique before, and this is a great way to have an inlay. So I'm going to take my surgical tape and I'm going to tape all of the open areas from the back so that the sticky side is facing up. And I'm going to tape it all the way up to the edge but not over that bottom edge. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So here it is all covered up, and you can see I went up to the edge but not over because I'm going to remove that top portion. Now I didn't get it exactly right, so in some areas I did go over, but it's not a big deal, and I'll show you how to fix that. So I'm going to cut the edge on the top and the bottom, so I'm just using that left side of the watercolor panel. And because I didn't go over that white edge, it'll pop right off, except for in the places where I did go over the edge with that surgical tape. But the surgical tape, it's not permanent. It comes right off. It's really easy to work with. So in the edges where I went over, I'm just going to pull it back. It pulls back very easily. I'll just take my scissors and I just trim it back. And so I just did that in a couple of the spots that I went over. Now I'll pull my pieces back and I'm going to place them in. So this is kind of like a puzzle. So if you like puzzles, you'll really enjoy this. If you don't like puzzles, I don't know. But I actually found this to be quite relaxing, and it was kind of fun to put all the pieces together. I thought some people might not want to do this because it might take some time. So I timed it, and it turned out to be about 8 minutes. And that was going at a very leisurely pace, which I didn't think was too much time. So now that I've got all my pieces back together, that panel is finished, and I'm going to work on the background behind it. I have a piece of crumb cake cardstock by Stampin' Up, and I'm just going to draw a few lines with my white gel pen. I do one side and then the other side. That way it gives it a chance to dry because it will smear if you touch it. And I'm using my ruler to make sure they're straight. I usually do my sentiments in black or brown because I like them to stand out. This is Summer Garden, by the way, by Simon Says Stamp. But in this case, it was such a soft and pretty card, I decided to use white. So I'm going to stamp this with my Misty using some Versamark ink, and then I'm going to sprinkle it with some white embossing powder and heat it to set it. It was just a nice way to add the sentiment without it being too overbearing. And now I'll finish up the card by putting this panel on a folded piece of Neenah Solar White. And then I have my Scotch foam tape on the back of my flower panel, and I'll pop it right there on the card. And this is a nice way to get your inlay but still get it popped up on the card. Alright, so that's that card. And now I'm going to start on the next card, which uses the positive watercolor piece. I've got 3 pieces of cardstock. I've got my folded card base, 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I've got Stampin' Up! Black cardstock, the same size, and Neenah cardstock that's cut 1/4 of an inch on each side. So I have an 1/8 of an inch mat. So I'm going to position my die where I want it, and then I'm going to take the negative. Remember, I cut that white one out, and I kept the negative. I wish I would have cut it more toward the center of this cardstock. But I'm going to position it on top of or right around the die, and then I'll flip it over very carefully. And then what I'll do is I'm going to take some surgical tape to adhere these 2 pieces together. So the negative of the white cardstock is actually going to serve as a template. So I'm going to remove the die, and then I have some showing from that Neenah piece, that Neenah panel that I had. So I want to cover that up because I don't want it to get any of my ink. So I'll just put a couple of pieces of surgical tape over it, which is nice because it'll help secure it to my craft mat while I apply the Versamark. So I'm going to very carefully, moving really in an up and down motion, apply this Versamark ink over the whole entire area, making sure I get all the way up to the edge on all sides. And then I'm going to remove my template. So I've got a little bit of tape on the front, a little bit of tape on the back. So I'm going to speed this up. I'm just going to carefully remove it, and then I'll flip it over and take off those pieces from the back. And then I'm going to use some Iridescent Ice Stampin' Up! Embossing powder. So this is just glitter and embossing powder mixed together, and has a really nice, pretty iridescent look to it. So I'll sprinkle it on top. And where I had put that surgical tape, it left a little bit of a sticky residue, and I forgot it does that. So I need to get my paintbrush, and I'm just going to brush the edge where I had that tape, and it'll come off. So this is, if you ever get some embossing powder where you don't want it to be for one reason or another, just take a brush and brush it off before you heat set it, and it won't stick at all. Now it's time to heat set this. You'll know this powder is heat set because it turns a little shinier. And I always heat the back of my cardstock. I really think this helps a lot with the warping. And now it's time to adhere the die cut. The first time I tried this, I used 2A glue pen, but it dried too quickly, and it wasn't thick enough to really adhere to a little bit of the texture that we have from the glitter. So I took my Tombow Mono Multi Glue, and I also think you could use the Multi-Medium Matte. That would work great too. And I'm just applying all these little dots all over the place, and because it's thick enough, it's not going to dry too fast. So I'm going to take my tweezers and I'll flip it over, and I'm going to position it exactly right over my iridescent ice. And because I use the negative of this die cut, it should fit perfectly over those edges. So once I've got it placed, I figured I need to kind of hold it in place for a little bit. So what I decided to do was cover it with a piece of paper. You'll see when I do that in a second here, once I get it all adhered. Put a piece of paper over it, and then I put my MISTI on top, which kind of was a very wide, sort of flat, solid surface. And then after I was holding it there for a minute, I thought, you know what, I bet it's sticking to the paper. So I took the MISTI off, and sure enough, it was sticking a little bit to the paper. And what I should have done is I should have flipped it over. So I thought of it here, I'm like, oh, okay, I'll just flip it over because it's not going to stick to my craft mat. So I flipped it over, I put a piece of paper over it, and then I put my MISTI on top. And I just held it down for a minute or two, probably not even that long, and pulled it off, and it worked perfectly. It was perfectly adhered in all the right places. So now I'm going to work on my sentiment. I'm using the Altenew Label Love. I love this when you want to add a black sentiment with white wording. And so I'm going to stamp this with some VersaFine Black Onyx ink, and then I like to cut these out manually with a scissor. I'm going to adhere my flower panel to my black cardstock so that I have a mat on all sides. Then I'll take my black cardstock and adhere this to my card base. So I had all this black around the edge, but no black on the inside, and that's why I decided to add the black sentiment. So I'm going to put my dimensionals on the back and adhere it kind of in the middle, so the black color goes around the edge and then it hits the sentiment and comes in. It sort of provides continuity for the black. And then I thought, you know, I need a little bit extra, so I decided to put some sequins. It's a great way to add some more interest to your card without really taking anything away. And so I'm using these Stampin' Up! Sequins. There's all different neutral colors, so gold, silver, white, clear, and black. And I'm going to pull a couple of those out with my pick-me-up stick. And then I grabbed my Simon Says stamp. I think these are called Moonshine sequins. They're all different sizes of the iridescent, so they kind of go with the iridescent ice. And I'm going to take two of those, one for the top and one for the bottom. And they're a little bit smaller, so a little variation in size. And what I like to do is pick it up with my left hand, dot with my right hand, and then put it right back. That way I don't have to think about where I'm putting them. So pick it up with the left, drop with the right the glue, and then put it back. Anyway, so that is the other card for today. You can see how pretty it is inside the rose to have all that iridescent glitter. So that's this card, and then I have my other card I'm going to pull back in here so you can see that I use the positive and the negative of the die. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.